As a portrait photographer, if I miss the mark with my skin tones, people are gonna look sick in the final edits. But I no longer have to deal with that because I built a system based on videography tools that help me make sure that I nail the skin tones every single time. And that's because in the past I was relying solely on my eyes, and they can trick me pretty easily because I'm looking at a photo for more than 5 minutes at a time, while the viewer is gonna look at it for a few seconds, and if the skin tones look off, it's gonna swipe right past it in less than few seconds. And the best part about this method is that it works regardless of how challenging the lighting situation is. For example, in this portrait right here, we are under the canopy, and that meant that the sunlight was filtered by the leaves and all the light that was bouncing around was tinted green, but the skin tones still manage to look right in the final photo. And also it works in nighttime where you might not always have the best light available to you. For example, here we're out in town and I was using the light coming from a window on the right side of the frame, which was surely not high CRI lighting. So here are the three main things that we need to focus on when we're talking about skin tones. First of all, we have to talk about white balance, because if we start with a bad white balance, we're really not gonna end up with pleasant looking skins, since our skin is usually around the orange mark, and if our photos have the wrong white balance, we're gonna mess up the skin tones really fast. The next up is exposure, because our skin needs to look bright and well exposed if you want to look natural and healthy. And finally, we have to talk about getting the right hue in our portraits to make sure that the skin tone looks natural and it doesn't lean into green or red tones. So I'm gonna start with this portrait right here, which was again shot in a park under the trees, and the light was filtered by the trees, so we have a lot of that green cast. And you'd be tempted to say, well, he's wearing a white shirt, so why not just use the eyedropper and pick somewhere on his shirt to fix the white balance? And while that might give you decent looking results, if we push the vibrance and saturation to 100%, you can see that his entire skin is falling within orange, and not even the shadows on his shirt are getting blue. And that's a sign that we don't really have the right white balance, because when we're pushing the vibrance and saturation, we usually want our photos to have bluish leaning shadows. So I'm gonna push the white balance to the left, and you can see that his shirt is getting blue now because it's in the shadow. Keep in mind, this was the sun behind of him, so the shirt should be in the shadow, and shadows are blue whenever you're shooting outdoors. And also we can see the highlight on his forehead that is getting really magenta. So I'm going to push the tint to the left as well, just a tiny bit, until that magenta starts to disappear. And now let's reset the vibrance and saturation back to the original percentage, and you can see that the photo looks almost like it lost some saturation, but that's just the white balance being precise, and we can start editing our photo with the right white balance. And while I can get a pretty decent white balance by maxing out my vibrance and saturation and then making sure that my shadows lean bluish or that my highlights on the face are pretty neutral, I do prefer to use a vector scope. And for those of you that don't know what a vector scope is, it's basically this diagram right here. It has the color circle starting with red here and going around through all the hues, and it's displaying the entirety of my photo as a rearranged pixel on a color wheel. And the one that I'm using right now, it's a third-party software, but a vector scope is coming to Lightroom pretty soon. And the one that I'm using is using the information based on a screen capture, so I can just resize this yellow rectangle and the vector scope will show me just what's inside of it, and this is gonna be really helpful later on. But because for now all I wanna do is fix the white balance in the photo, which by the way I just resetted, I can look at the vector scope and see that the entire thing is leaning towards the bottom part right here, which is green and cyan. So I'm going to push the tint a bit to the right until all this data right here is going towards the middle of the circle, and also I'm going to push the white balance towards warmth just a tiny bit more, so I can see right now when I zoom out the vector scope that most of the stuff that's in the vector scope, it's actually centered in the middle of the circle. And just like that, I fixed the white balance in my photos using the vector scope without wasting any time and with much more precision than just guessing while pulling around on the sliders. But now that I have the right white balance to start my edit, I also need to make sure that my skin tones fall exactly where they should in order for them to look nice and healthy. And by far, my favorite method of making sure that my skin tones are properly exposed is false color. And I like it so much that I even created a false color camera profile, which I can apply to my photos directly in Lightroom. This way, to get healthy looking skin tones, all I have to do is make sure that the midtones on the face fall right against the gray or light gray area, in the case of a Caucasian male like this photo right here. So what I'm gonna do is push up the exposure, which I just did. I'm going to pull down the highlights just a tiny bit until the highlights on his forehead no longer go that strong into pinks, and I'm also going to push the shadows and the blacks up just a tiny bit more. I'm looking for a nice gradient that's going from light gray to dark gray right here on his face, but I'm trying to mostly avoid shadows that are going into blue right on the face. And when I switch back to Adobe Color right now, you can see that my photo is properly exposed for the skin tones on his face. And if you wanna grab the false color camera profile for Lightroom yourself and try it out, you can do so on my website right here. And also there you'll find a ton of other tools and presets that can improve your Lightroom editing process. Just that, as you saw in my previous video, I recently discovered linear camera profiles, which is a nice way to take my photos to the next level, but it also makes the false color camera profile just a tiny bit obsolete. And that made me pivot, and I actually came up with a much better solution. I'm using OBS, the free streaming/screen capturing software, and I have that running on my second monitor. And in here, I have it set up so it captures the screen that I'm doing my edits on. But on top of this screen capture, I can go to filters and I can apply my false color LUT that I have created when I created the false color camera profile. And this way, I can have a real-time preview of what's happening on my main monitor that's reacting to whatever I'm doing while pulling on the sliders. And it's not even consuming that many resources from my computer. But on top of that, I can even enable this scale that you've seen before in my videos. And this way I even have the legend of my false color LUT in real time while I'm adjusting my photo. And honestly, I'm kinda surprised nobody figured out this before, or at least nobody's talking about this method, cause it's working really well and you get a false color preview in real time on whatever image you're working on, regardless of the software that you're using to edit that photo. And false color can be super useful, especially for skin tones. But make sure you hit subscribe because I'm also working on a false color preview that doesn't need OBS and might include some extras in the near future. And now coming back to our photo, where we already have a good base with well-exposed skin tones, the next logical step is to start color grading. And no matter what we do here, we're gonna skew the color of our skin tones around a bit, because color grading implies adding color to our photos. And right now, I'm looking through my collection of color response curve, and I think for this photo, a really good match would be something like Fujicolor 200 or Kodak Gold that looks like this, but I'm gonna go for something that does the most damage to my skin tones, just to show you how I then come around to fix them. So I'm looking for a color response curve like this Kodak Vision 200T that pushes my skin tones around and gives the entire photo this rather cyan look. And just to be clear, I'm not using a tungsten film on a daylight portrait just because I think it's quirky or that I think this will result in a good final photo. I'm doing this because I want to have my skin tones be affected by the color grade as much as possible, so I can demonstrate the tools and the principles that I use when I'm doing my final edit. That being said, I'm gonna pop up the vector scope once again, and this time I'm gonna make the selection right around his face. And we can see right now on the vector scope that we have mostly green and blue tones, and that is reflected in the photo. So the first thing that I'm gonna do is adjust my white balance once again to match this film emulation. So I'm pushing some magenta and some warmth into the photo, and we can start to see that it's already looking a bit better. But if I zoom out the vector scope right now, we can see this line that is forming right against the skin tone line, but it's also a bit skewed towards green. So I'm gonna push my magenta a bit further, and you can start to see that the skin tones in the photo are looking already much better because my selection in the vector scope looks like this. So it's mostly his head, and now we have most of what's in the selection right against the skin tone line. But if in my color grade I would have pushed something like, let's say, the green primary to the right and maybe the blue primary to the left, and messed up the colors like that, we can now see that instead of a line that's parallel with the skin tone line but shifted towards green, we now have a line on the vector scope that's going a bit skewed at an angle. And whenever that happens, I'm using a mask, and here I just did a luminance based mask by pressing Shift Q, and in this mask I'm going to use the hue slider to rotate the vector scope around with a few degrees until the skin tones start to align with the skin tone line in my vector scope. And just like that, with +4 hue, I managed to fix the hue of the skin in the photo. But right now the image still doesn't look great because I'm lacking a ton of contrast because of the color response curve. It flattened out the entire photo, and I have to adjust the black and the white point to get some nice contrast back into the image. And to do that, I'm going back into the select all mask, and I'm going to tug on the black point of the tone curve quite significantly until my histogram is starting to touch up here. And also I'm going to push my white point to the right just a tiny bit more. But because I can see how different the red primary is from the other twos, I prefer to increase the highlights in the image instead of pushing my white point very far, this way getting a much nicer filmic tone and less burned out spots here in the foliage behind of him. And overall, I'm pretty happy with how the skin tones look in the photo right now. The photo itself does need a few more things like a bit of grain, and I'm gonna apply my all-in-one grain preset, and you can see how it created a few masks to apply different amount of grain to different areas of the photo based on luminosity. And I'm also going to quickly create another luminosity based mask. With this one, I'm going to target the midtones, and in here I'm gonna push my clarity and texture to the left to give the photo just a bit of bloom. And very quickly I'm going to add one more linear gradient on the bottom part of the photo, and in this one all I'm gonna do is grab my midtones in the curve panel and drag it down just a tiny bit so I have more accentuated shadows in this bottom part of the image and it would be less distracting. And now let's go back to OBS, and in here I'm going to toggle the false color LUT, and you can see it in real time with me. The shadows on his face are a bit bright. So what I'm gonna do is go to my shadow slider and pull it down just a tiny bit, and I think I can do even better if I go to my select all mask and use the eyedropper on the side of his face right around here to pull the shadows in this photo a bit down as well. And in the false color preview I can also see that my highlights are not that bright, so I'm also pushing my midtones, and also I'm gonna reduce the black point so I have a bit more of a faded look with a bit of a filmic tone that looks something like this on the false color. Although I still think the photo looks slightly too dark and I might pump up the exposure just a tiny bit. We can see now that the highlights on his face are in the pinkish zone, the midtones are over here gray neutral, and the shadows are starting to lean in the green and cold tones. And this means that we have a nice range over the face, and the skin tones are going to look nice and natural and healthy when I now toggle off the false color LUT. And for this quick edit, I will do one more thing. I'm going to go and create a large radial gradient on the right part of the image so I can bring up the highlights and the shadows in front of him, but I'm trying to stay away from illuminating his face too much. So something like this, just to open up the image on the right side and reduce the contrast that was created by this branch right here. And although the color grade is not amazing, and I would probably go in with the vector scope and try to create a nicer color palette, you can see that I got my skin tones to look absolutely amazing and his skin looks nice and vibrant without too much hustle by using these tools that come from the video industry. And there's one last thing that we have to take into consideration when we're talking about skin tones that look nice and natural, and that's saturation. And in this photo we do have some areas with pretty harsh saturation, especially here in the darker parts of his skin where we have some spots that are starting to look a bit too orangey and maybe even leaning a bit into magenta. So what I'm gonna do is go in here to the mask that has a really strong S-curve, because I know this is creating some problems, and I'm gonna pull down the refine saturation slider roughly to around 50 or maybe a bit more. And instead of getting my saturation from this very strong S-curve, I'm going to create a new luminance range mask. Once again, I pressed Shift Q for this, and in this one, I'm going to target the midtones with a nice large fall off towards the highlight, but I'm mostly leaving the bright spots in the photo unaffected. And in here, I'm going to push my saturation to something like plus 20, maybe a bit more, so the skin tones don't look that oversaturated, and I can even tweak the mask so it affects the shadows a bit less, so we don't have the problem that we had before. But if you want to learn more about this technique of decoupling the saturation from a strong S-curve, I would encourage you to go watch this video because this one is almost over. If you feel like you learned something new today, don't forget to hit the like button and maybe share this video with a photographer friend. And if you want to use any of the tools that I showed in this video, you can check out my website where you will find the false color camera profile, color response curve, and the grain presets all in my Lightroom preset store.